Hello there, my friend. It is that time again, when the outside world begins to soften, and your thoughts are invited to wander somewhere gently useless. Tonight, we embark on a journey that serves no practical purpose whatsoever, and that's precisely what makes it perfect for now. Picture this. You are perched gingerly on a cold stone slab, high above the ground, the wind whispering up from the moat far below. You shift slightly, but the wood creaks alarmingly beneath you, a plank between dignity and disaster. Of course, none of this will help you in your waking life. But here, in this slow stream of mildly interesting irrelevance, you're welcome to drift. So, just before we immerse ourselves fully in this delightfully unnecessary narrative, should you find a strange sort of comfort in these gently meandering tales, a kind of quiet joy in learning things you'll almost certainly forget by morning, then know that your company here is quietly appreciated. And if these whispers from the past bring a smile, or perhaps a moment of peace, do consider sharing this quiet corner with a friend who might also enjoy such gentle uselessness, or perhaps even follow along so these old stones, or feathers or threads, know their tales are finding a welcome ear. And if you happen to be listening from a distant corner of the world, perhaps at a time when most are deep in dreams or still chasing deadlines, do feel free to share where you are and what time it is. It's oddly reassuring to know where these harmless little reflections are drifting off to. Now, settle in, adjust your blanket, take a soft, slow breath, and let's begin. From where I hang, a modest iron hinge on the inside of the chamber door, I've seen you come in with caution. I've heard the murmurs too. They always enter quietly, as though embarrassed to acknowledge this room exists, though none ever leave without feeling something memorable. These upper tower toilets, garderobes they were called, were not designed for comfort, nor even for modesty. They were usually little more than holes in protruding stone chutes, set directly above the moat or a sheer castle wall. The assumption, I suppose, was that what left would simply go away. But wind, you see, has ideas of its own. The very first thing you notice, beyond the echoing drip below, is the draft. It snakes around your ankles like a cat made of fog, carrying with it centuries of sighs and regrets. In winter, the cold alone could bring a man to tears before the business even began. A historian once noted that a knight may ride boldly into battle, yet freeze in contemplation atop the privy. I cannot confirm that quote, but I believe it with all my hinges. Now, there was a time, I think it was sometime around the mid-13th century, when Lady Gwyneth of Barrystone declared that her garderobe was possessed by unkind winds and scornful odors. She petitioned her husband, a rather preoccupied baron, for woolen drapery and lavender bundles. He granted her instead a thicker cloak and suggested she brace her humors. A romantic he was not. What's curious, though, is the human insistence that higher meant safer. And yet, many a soul met their end from a poorly placed step or a half-rotted board. You'd be surprised how often death began with the sentence, "I just need a moment of privacy." I recall one squire who lost his balance while reading poetry aloud to impress a girl waiting down below. The moat did not appreciate sonnets. And then there's the tale of the unfortunate Sir Edric, who, according to the cook's apprentice and 3 mildly drunk guards, disappeared entirely one foggy morning after entering the tower's northern garderobe. They say his last words were, "Is it supposed to wobble like this?" Some speculate that the tower floor gave way. Others whisper about a jealous falconer and a trapdoor conspiracy. I, on the other hand, suspect the wind. It has a long memory and a mischievous streak. There is a reason we objects avoid the gusts. Even now you sit cautiously, perhaps half listening for creaks, half distracted by the view of the stars between the slats. You try not to think of what lies beneath. There is a comfort, I imagine, in imagining the moat as a faraway abyss. But I know better. I've heard what lives in it. Frogs, yes. Rats, likely. But also the occasional ring, diary page, or half-eaten pear hurled in a fit of rage. One real historian, whose name I forget, but whose breath always smelled of onions, Once mused that garderobes were not merely plumbing, but psychological thresholds, where lords became men, where armor clanked in humility, and where the echoes of centuries lingered unceremoniously in the air. I rather liked that idea, though I suspect he only said it to impress a girl at the archives. Even we iron hinges have our mysteries. Sometimes we swing on our own, not from ghosts, no, but from drafts shaped by architecture forgotten, or perhaps by the sigh of an old memory revisiting its last moment of privacy. And as you finally stand again, shivering, but intact, you fumble with the latch, me, with a mixture of gratitude and unease. I creak gently in return. I've held firmer against worse. Sleep now, knowing this, that your medieval predecessors braved much to answer nature's call, and often it called them back down in ways both literal and final. But tonight, you are safe. The only thing falling is the evening silence, and it lands softly across your thoughts. You return once more, not quite to the same place, but near enough that the stone beneath your feet hums with recognition. The night is deep now. A low mist has begun to gather, curling like whispered secrets around the edges of the keep. You stand at the edge of the castle wall, near an alcove no one speaks of by name. Most walk past it quickly, heads down, breath held. But you, perhaps guided by curiosity, or the slight metallic scent in the air, you linger. From where I rest, embedded in the wall as a carved iron fixture, once a torch holder, now forgotten, I have seen the kind of things that refuse to be remembered aloud. This is where they came at night. The gong farmers. Ah yes, noble in task, if not in title. These were the brave, often low-born men who cleaned out the cesspits and waste shafts of medieval towns and castles. Paid handsomely, by comparison, but treated with a level of avoidance typically reserved for the plague. Some called them night soil men. I prefer the older name. Gong was the Middle English word for dung, and farming it. Well, it took a particular sort of resilience. I remember one in particular, Jareth. Small of frame, but stout of foot, he moved with the rhythm of someone who knew every corner of waste the way a bard knows his strings. He would arrive long after sundown, when the chatter had quieted, and only the owls dared look directly at the smell. He carried with him a wide wooden shovel, a sloshing leather bucket, and a tune he hummed through his teeth. Some say to mask the stench, others say to hold madness at bay. It is said they worked best in winter, when the cold turned the worst of it solid. In summer, however, well, I can still taste the air from those nights. Not with a tongue, of course. But iron has its ways of remembering. Strange things were lost to those pits. Yes, gold coins and misplaced goblets. But also secrets, illicit letters, broken locket chains. There was once even a ledger book torn in half and flung down in fury by a noblewoman who had no understanding of mathematics, but a keen grasp of shame. And here's something you may not know. Some historians, though not the most popular ones, believe that gong farmers sometimes made extra coin by retrieving certain discarded items, cleaning them, selling them back. A strange economy, isn't it? Built on the notion that what disappears beneath us might one day return, slightly scrubbed and available at a discount. The stone here remembers a winter when the pit overflowed. Not upward, no, but outward. Through a crack in the wall, just wide enough to whisper. I heard everything that night. The angry clatter of boots, the frantic scraping of buckets, the sharp swear of a nobleman who had, moments earlier, declared himself above all things earthy. A declaration that did not age well. But the oddest thing I ever heard came not from a person, but from the rats. They argued, you see. I swear it. Late at night, beneath the pit, I heard squeaks and scrapes in distinct patterns. Debates, perhaps. Over territory. Or dinner. Or maybe who got to keep the ivory hairpin that had fallen through the grate that day. There was always movement. Gong farmers would hum, whistle, or recite prayers. And there were incidents. Yes, one farmer, a lad new to the trade, slipped on a rung while descending into a particularly deep pit beneath the northern cloister. He was not found until spring thaw. The stone, I confess, still echoes when the frost comes. Even now, as you breathe in, Though perhaps you wish you hadn't. You can almost sense the rhythm of the old shovels, the dull clunk of waste being moved from one shadowy place to another. It's not glamorous, but it is consistent, predictable, oddly soothing in the right mindset. We iron fixtures don't judge. We've held torches for kings and piss pots for squires. It's all weight, in the end. And some weights are heavier than others, though not always in the way you expect. So if you feel tonight like your troubles are too much, that you are buried in something less than poetic, remember Jareth and his midnight waltz. He whistled in the dark. He carried the stink of an entire keep. And still, on some nights, I believe he danced. Sleep now, knowing this, that even the lowest task, done quietly and well, becomes part of the rhythm of this old world. And some melodies, even those played on buckets and shovels, linger in the stones far longer than trumpets ever will. You return again, quiet-footed, as if the stones beneath you might remember the tales you've already heard. And perhaps they do. The corridor tonight feels a little cooler, as if drawing in its breath. The torches flicker less brightly here, their light shrinking from the damp edges of the walls. This is the part of the castle where few sleep deeply. From where I sit, a modest ring of rusted iron nailed into the mortar of the garderobe arch. I have heard more whimpers than laughter. I was once part of a curtain rod, you know. A thick velvet drape once hung from me to separate the seat from the cold night beyond. But that curtain was lost long ago. Perhaps taken by wind, or rumor, or rats with an eye for luxury. It was through this very door, perhaps some 300 winters past, that Duke Alwyn of Dripwell made his final entrance. A rather plump man of modest intelligence but great conviction, he was known to favor prunes and declarations in equal measure. He had dined heavily that evening, an anniversary feast, though for which wife the records never agree. Following his meal, he retired alone to this very garderobe to compose his inner self, as he reportedly phrased it, much to the distress of the scribes present. And then, nothing. Oh, how they searched. Torches, dogs, shouts bouncing off the ramparts. They pulled up floorboards, opened barrels, questioned cooks and falconers alike. But no trace of the Duke remained. Just his walking stick, propped neatly against the wall beside the chute. I remember the silence that followed. It was not the silence of grief. Not at first. It was the quiet of confusion, of awkwardly waiting for a punchline that never came. Naturally, the theories bloomed like mushrooms after rain. The kitchen boy claimed the Duke had been spirited away by a vengeful ghost, offended by the nobleman's choice of sausages. A maid swore she saw a glowing hand reach up from the pit and gently tug. Others suspected poison, not by mouth, but by atmosphere. I've known more than one soul to pass out in a poorly ventilated shaft, but the truth is less conclusive. You see, these guardrobes, particularly the ones that jutted out over steep castle walls or deep vertical shafts, were precarious things. Wooden beams rot, stone shifts. People lean too far forward while swatting at a moth. Even the castle engineer, a man with chalky fingers and suspiciously few teeth, suggested with some embarrassment that perhaps the Duke had simply slipped. Still, there's a detail that's never left me. The guards swore that when they peered down into the shaft that night, there was no trace, no splash, no cloth, no sound. Just a thin mist curling upward, unnaturally cold, and the faint scent of lavender. Even now, the chamber smells faintly sweet, not unpleasant, just unexpected, like a flower blooming where no seed was planted. I've heard it said that the Duke haunts this place, though not in the usual way. He does not moan or clatter chains. Instead, he whispers advice, always at the worst moment. Once, a knight claimed he heard a faint voice say, "Lean forward a bit more," just as he lost his footing. Another time, a cook swore she heard, "Try adding more mint," just before her stew was declared unfit for dogs. There are, of course, more scholarly interpretations. One chronicler suggested that the Duke faked his disappearance to escape his debts. A bold claim, given that he was not known for subtlety, and famously could not ride a horse without falling off sideways. Others speculate he may have been the victim of a rare architectural flaw. A shaft that led not to the moat, but into a forgotten tunnel, a sort of stone oubliette for bodily humors. The rats, I might add, are divided. Some say he lives among them now, a generous provider of breadcrumbs and crumbs of gossip. Others claim he tasted foul and was rejected. As you settle now, back against the cool stone, you might feel the smallest tickle of unease. Not fear. No, nothing so sharp. Just the sense that this place remembers things more clearly than people do. Rest now, knowing this, that even the most pompous nobles may vanish in the most ridiculous ways, and that sometimes history flushes its own pages, leaving only echoes, rumors, and a faint trace of lavender where certainty should be. The moon tonight hangs low and soft, a swollen pearl barely held aloft by the haze. Somewhere in the courtyard, a lute sighs out its last drunken chord, and the guards at the gate begin to hum lullabies they'll never admit to knowing. You, meanwhile, linger at the edge of the keep, drawn again to that familiar, awkward niche in the architecture. Yes, the garderobe. You pretend it's for the breeze, or perhaps the view, but we both know it's something deeper, stranger. You are not the first to be oddly fascinated by this peculiar intersection of necessity and nobility. I know, because I, a humble gargoyle no one remembers carving, fixed high above the stone chute's exit, have watched for centuries. My face is frozen in a grimace that some believe is meant to ward off evil. In truth, I'm trying not to breathe through my non-existent nose. Tonight, the frogs have returned. They always do in spring, drawn by the warmth, the dripping, the promise of leftovers unclaimed by gravity. Some evenings they're quiet. Tonight they sing. There was a time when this sound was considered divine. A bishop once proclaimed that frogs croaking near a privy were messengers from Saint Bernard himself, come to bless the digestive systems of the faithful. He was later found to have an unusual affection for boiled spirits and questionable theology. But here's what I've noticed. The frogs and the noble farts often harmonize. It's uncanny. A chorus of amphibian chirps and low, echoing reverberations that sound, frankly, rehearsed. Once, I remember this clearly. A squire emerged from the chamber red-faced after a particularly explosive moment, only to be met by a perfectly timed ribbit from below. He dropped his belt in fright and fled. There is a strange democracy in flatulence. Kings and chambermaids alike have walked through that door, and every one of them, regardless of title, left behind a sound I now associate with humility. You might find it funny, but among the castle's unseen inhabitants, the spiders in the rafters, the moths in the curtains, the beetles behind the mortar, we consider royal flatulence to be something of a weather forecast. A shift in tone, expect thunder, a squeak followed by silence, storm brewing in the kitchens. Of course, human historians rarely document these matters with care. One monastic journal refers simply to unusual acoustics during Vespers, which, I happen to know, was caused by Lord Malcolm attempting to sneak a goose leg into the choir and regretting it by stanza 3. Even the tapestries once had opinions. I recall one particularly vocal piece, a depiction of St. Cuthbert and a bear, which used to flutter aggressively whenever a noble's digestion turned musical. It was eventually moved to the laundry after too many accidental snickers during court. Now, here's a curious truth I've absorbed, and I use that word with all due gravity. Many garderobes were designed acoustically. The shafts weren't just vertical. They were angled, narrowed, even subtly curved, not only for flow, but for sound. Some believe this was unintentional. Others, myself included, suspect certain architects had a wicked sense of humor. After all, why else would echoes carry so clearly from the privy to the chapel below? There's a phrase the mice use. Yes, they have language of sorts. When the frogs sing, someone's shame is echoing. I rather like it. You shift your weight on the stone bench now, subtly checking for creaks. A wise move. Not all stones are to be trusted, and some, I say this with pride, never forget the feel of boots tiptoeing away from an embarrassing moment. Let it comfort you. Even the proudest lords have emerged from this chamber looking like scolded children, their robes slightly askew, their dignity hastily realigned. It's where strategies paused, romances ended, and once, I kid you not, a duel was scheduled between two men who'd argued about who had the worst sound. They both lost, of course. The frogs won that evening, singing long into dawn. So sleep now, my curious companion, with the knowledge that royal echoes are neither shameful nor rare. They are simply part of the music of the medieval night. And if you hear a croak just as you drift off, it may be nothing. Or it may be a very old frog, applauding your humanity with a single, well-timed note. You're wandering now, not entirely by intention. The stone corridor bends like a thought you can't quite finish. And somewhere behind you, a door creaks in that very particular way that suggests it will never truly close again. From my perch, a dented brass handle on an old wooden door tucked near the servant's stair, I can tell you this is the part of the castle where slippered footsteps often scurry at midnight. It is here that the chamber pots live. Or, perhaps more accurately, where they hide. Ah yes, the chamber pot. So elegant in theory, so disastrous in practice. You see one now, balanced precariously on the edge of a low wooden bench. Someone has painted flowers on the side, a rather optimistic attempt at dignity. You approach cautiously, the way one might inspect a sleeping animal. That is wise. They don't bite. But oh, they do betray. In theory, the pot was a great invention. A private convenience before sunrise or after ale. Kept beneath the bed, tucked under chairs. Occasionally even disguised as stools. But in practice, they were small ceramic time bombs, waiting to be knocked over by a careless toe or jostled by an ambitious cat. There's a tale the tapestries still whisper. Yes, they do whisper, though only when no one's watching. A visiting noble once mistook a decorated pot for a fruit bowl. I won't describe what happened after he attempted to serve cherries from it, but the word scalded came up more than once, and no one looked directly at the maid for a week. Now, in the upper hall. You remember it, yes? The one with the slanted beams and the overconfident chandelier? There was once a notorious duchess who, either through laziness or theatrical flair, took to flinging the contents of her chamber pot from the window each morning, accompanied by the shout, "Bless the dawn!" One day, she misjudged the wind. The choir boys below sang an unusually short hymn that morning. To mitigate such incidents, some castles implemented etiquette bells, little tin things tied to strings near the bed, meant to be rung before someone used or emptied their pot. A sort of warning signal for nearby ears and noses. I rather liked those bells. They were honest. You might wonder why these pots weren't simply emptied into some central receptacle. A fine, modern idea. But in truth, many were emptied. Out the window. Into the moat. Or down rain drains. Or, most often, just slightly too near wherever the pot's owner last stood. There is a patch of courtyard just beneath the west tower that the moss still refuses to grow on. I suspect it remembers. And then, there's the strange case of Lady Mary Beth, who vanished one summer night. Not without trace, mind you. Her final cry was reportedly, "What's this pot doing in the hall?" Followed by a loud clatter and several weeks of polite silence. Her shoes were found. The pot too, but not her. Some suggest she ran away. Others think she joined the gong farmers out of spite. The mice, however, believe she slipped into a moment so embarrassing that reality itself rejected it, and she was quietly erased. Even now, as you lean lightly against the door, you might hear the faintest clink. Not of metal, but of ceramic on stone. An old pot settling into itself. Or perhaps remembering its last victim. And yet, for all their hazard, there was affection too. Some were passed down through families, their porcelain lips kissed by generations. One pot even had a name. Sir Bucketson. No one knows why. But if you whispered his name in the guest quarters after midnight, the rats would scatter. What I'm saying, dear listener, is that every object, no matter how mundane, carries with it echoes. And those echoes do not always align with dignity. Rest now, in the soft quiet of this meandering tale, and know this: whether golden or cracked, chamber pots served both lords and beggars. And if they tip in the night, it is not mischief, merely gravity, doing what it does best: reminding us that no one, no matter how noble, is above a little spillage. Tonight, the castle feels different. You may not notice it at first, a subtle tightening in the wind, a pause in the creaking timbers, but something old and clever stirs in the walls. You've walked these corridors before, yet somehow you feel as though you've stumbled into a forgotten passage, not listed on any map. You pause beside a narrow slit in the stone, too high for a window, too small for a man. But from my place, an old iron chain still embedded in the shaft wall below, I can tell you precisely what it is. It's a chute, a waste chute. And once, long ago, it brought down more than refuse. Yes, strange as it may sound, toilets were not just conveniences in medieval fortifications. They were vulnerabilities, weak points, gaps in the armor, and every cunning invader knew it. Picture this: a castle under siege, arrows hissing from the parapets, boiling oil poised at the ready, and yet, down below, a man in mud-stained armor whispers to his companion, "Check the latrines." You see, many garderobes, those narrow, precarious towers we've discussed before, jutted from the wall's edge, built over open shafts that dumped waste into ditches, moats, or cesspits. Convenient for flow, but also a hole in the wall, literally. And in war, a hole is always an opportunity. One of the earliest documented breaches of a fortified castle, in 1203, at Château Gaillard in Normandy, was not through the main gate, nor over the walls. It was through the waste shaft. A group of attackers wriggled through a drain, climbed up into the latrine tunnel, and emerged inside the castle walls, soiled but victorious. Imagine the pride. And the smell. From my perspective, slung low and damp near just such a shaft, I can confirm, humans have underestimated stink in strategy for centuries. The defensive-minded tried to adapt. Some installed iron grates over their shafts. Others poured lime regularly to deter loitering, or perhaps just to discourage ambition. A few castles even built decoy garderobes with false lids that dropped intruders into pits lined with spikes. Spikes, designed not for soldiers, but for someone who crawled in through a sewage tunnel, thinking they were clever. There's a spot just beyond the east turret where I once heard two sentries argue. One insisted the smell was part of the deterrent system. The other claimed it was the cook's fault. Neither realized that below their boots, in the very pipe they were leaning over, a spy had wedged himself for 2 full hours before abandoning his mission, sobbing quietly into straw. But my favorite tale comes from Birkenshade Keep, a minor fortress mostly known for housing more goats than soldiers. There, during a particularly unimportant conflict, a rival lord attempted to send his smallest cousin, a wiry lad with more enthusiasm than sense, up through the shaft of the outer privy. He made it halfway. Then, stuck fast, he began to shout about the unfairness of war and how no hero should have to suffer such indignity. His voice echoed through the plumbing and into the great hall, where a feast was underway. Dessert was cancelled. The boy was extracted. He later became a monk. Still, it makes you think, doesn't it? For all their pomp and ceremony, medieval strongholds depended on clever design, thick walls, and well-hidden poop chutes. And sometimes, all it took was one overlooked crevice for a mighty fortress to crumble. Not from fire, not from siege engines, but from the quiet determination of a man with a torch and an iron stomach. Even the spiders in the corners know this. They hang just above the shafts, whispering tales of would-be conquerors who never considered the smell. One once claimed that the fate of 3 small kingdoms was decided because a duke refused to reinforce his latrine shaft, citing cost. I do not know if that's true, but it feels true. So now, as you lie back and let your breath ease, remember this. Sometimes, the way in is not the grand gate or the lofty tower, but the place no one wants to talk about. And sometimes, the quietest victories come not from swords, but from silence, patience, and a very low tolerance for pride. Rest well, my clever friend. And should you ever design a castle of your own, be sure to mind the drains. Tonight, the corridors smell sweeter than usual. Faintly herbal, like thyme and dried rose petals, with just a whisper of damp stone. You follow the scent without thinking, the way moths drift toward lanterns, and find yourself in a room that shouldn't feel as luxurious as it does. From where I linger, once the silver cap of a lavender sachet, now wedged into a crack in the floor, I can tell you this room has held more secrets than sermons. This was a royal garderobe, the sort reserved for kings and visiting dignitaries. Its stone is smoother, its window higher, and, most noticeably, it does not stink. Or at least, not in the usual way. You inhale carefully. You notice the dried bundles tucked into the corners. Lavender, rosemary, mint, perhaps a crushed orange peel, preserved beyond reason. A queen's effort, most likely, or a clever steward's. You see, while the common folk bore the brunt of bodily truths, the noble classes did not so much escape them as decorate them. A king still needed a privy, of course, but heaven forbid it smell like one. So they stuffed herbs into the shafts, laced floral oils around the chamber, even commissioned special pots glazed with perfumed beeswax. There was once a bishop, a generous and gassy man, who demanded that 2 servants stand outside the door with fans soaked in rosewater, waving steadily to encourage the descent of miasma. He later died of heat stroke. A noble end, some say. Now here's a peculiar truth I've absorbed. The strength of a scent in the royal privy was once interpreted as a sign of favor. If the air smelled sweet upon your exit, it meant your business had been blessed, or at least not cursed. If it stank, well, tongues would wag. One chronicler describes a courtier who, having emerged from the king's chamber in a cloud of suspicious aroma, was immediately accused of treason, not for any real crime, but because his humors did offend the divine nose. He was reassigned to goat duty the next day. And the sachets. Oh, the sachets. Tiny cloth pouches filled with dried herbs and stitched shut with gold thread, carried in sleeves, tucked into collars, and sometimes dangled ostentatiously from belts. A kind of olfactory armor. I once overheard a lady-in-waiting boast that her sachet had protected her from 3 plagues and 2 suitors. But the most curious use came during an especially long winter, when the pipes froze, and all smells lingered too long. The queen at the time, sharp-eyed, strong-nosed, ordered sachets be sewn into the royal robes themselves. The result? A procession of nobility, who smelled faintly of soap and anxiety. Even now, the air in this room retains its softness. Not clean, exactly, just determinedly fragrant. The smell has seeped into the stone, woven itself into the very breath of the chamber. It is not a lie, but a gentle suggestion. A reminder that royalty is often maintained not by bloodline, but by the illusion of pleasantness. You may find it odd, the lengths to which they went, the flower-stuffed shafts, the scented oils poured daily into cracks, the costly perfumes designed to mask what all humans share. But then again, perhaps you understand. We all mask something. A fear, a thought, a memory we would rather tuck into a pouch and hang near our neck. There's an old spider that lives just under the stone shelf near the window. She's spun her web there for 12 generations. She told me once, yes, we talk, that the scent of lavender reminds her of funerals. I asked why. She said, because it hides decay too well. Sleep now, my thoughtful listener. Let the scent of false roses drift you into rest. And should you ever wake in the night and catch a hint of something floral in the air, remember, it may be a sign of favor, or it may be someone trying very hard not to be known. Tonight the castle creaks a little more than usual. Not loudly, just enough to make the silence feel populated. You walk with softer steps, as if not to disturb the memory of someone long gone, though no one told you his name. But I know it. From my vantage, a soot-stained nail at the base of the garderobe shaft, once meant to hold a rope for cleaning. I remember Thomas, the servant boy with the 2 large boots, and a habit of singing to himself while scrubbing things no one else would touch. He was 15, perhaps, or 17. He lied often about his age, depending on whether he wanted sympathy or ale. But he worked hard, always assigned the jobs that smelled worse than most, because he never complained. He'd whistle through the fumes like a minstrel in the sewer. And then, one morning, he was gone. It was a quiet disappearance, not the kind that sends bells ringing or guards running. Just an absence that grew heavier by the hour. The cook noticed first. "Thomas didn't fetch the brine water," she muttered, half to herself. Then someone pointed out his blanket hadn't moved. His boots were still by the wall, just barely worn down enough to fit. They searched, of course. Some. A few of the other servants lit torches and checked the moat path. One boy peered down the privy shaft, turned green, and promptly retired from curiosity. But no trace, no sound, not even a splash. And here's the part I remember best. The smell changed. Not worse. Not at first. Just sharper, more acidic, as if the air itself had held its breath. The frogs beneath the chute went silent for 3 nights. The moths in the pantry refused to flutter near the walls. No one spoke of it directly. They whispered instead. Some said Thomas had run off. Others believed he had slipped. The old ladder down to the waste vault was known to be missing 2 rungs. A few muttered about curses, though not when the steward was within earshot. But I know what I heard. That night, long after the others had gone to bed, there were footsteps, bare, light. They padded across the stone toward the shaft, stopped, and then a quiet thud echoed up. Not a fall, not quite. It was the sound of something, deciding. You may not believe this, but I've heard similar sounds before. Moments when someone realizes they've reached the edge of the shaft, of their duty, of their patience. And what happened to Thomas? Well, some think he slipped into the pit and was buried by time. Others believe he made it through a forgotten tunnel and left to start a new life, one that didn't smell of vinegar and shame. But the spiders disagree. They say he's still down there, not alive, not quite, but watching, waiting, holding fast to the last chore he was given. There's a superstition now among the newer servants. Never clean the vault at night, and never hum while you do it. That's how he knows you're near. Even I, a bent nail with no tongue, try not to echo when the wind hums too close. And yet, there's something about Thomas that lingers kindly in the stone. He was gentle, curious. He once tried to polish the walls around the privy with a cloth dipped in rosemary water, muttering, "Even filth can shine if you squint." I like that. So if, tonight, your dreams take you near a tunnel with dripping walls and a faint song just out of reach, don't be afraid. It might only be Thomas, checking the corners, whistling a tune no one else remembered to finish. Sleep well, dear wanderer, and may your burdens, however heavy, never lead you where the floorboards forget your name. Tonight feels softer, doesn't it? A hush has settled over the castle. Not silence, exactly, but a kind of agreement among the walls and wind not to speak too loudly. You find yourself drawn to a narrow hallway you've walked before, though it now feels different, as though the stone beneath your feet has chosen this moment to share a secret. From where I remain, folded and water-stained beneath a loose flagstone, I once was something more. A letter, or at least the idea of one. Ink faded now, the words smudged by moisture and time. But once, oh yes, I carried the breath of someone's heart. You wouldn't think of garderobes as romantic places, and rightly so, but even the most pungent corners of the world cannot escape the occasional flutter of hope. There was once a boy, a page, no more than 16, always blushing and always late. His name was Corin. He fancied a girl named Elodie, a kitchen maid, with a voice like honeyed bread, and a temper sharp enough to skin eels. Too shy to speak to her, he wrote. Every week, a note, sometimes a verse, sometimes a secret. Once, even a sketch of the stables where he claimed he'd build her a bench, so finely carved even the cats would weep. The trouble was, Corin had no idea where to hide them. Letters, in a castle, are dangerous things. Found, they become weapons. Read aloud, they become legend. He needed a place no one would dare reach into. So he chose the shelf beside the royal garderobe, behind a loose stone above the chute. Safe, he thought. Private, the one place no curious hands would grope. He was right. at first. But castles shift. Mortar crumbles. One sharp thunderclap, one sneeze from the steward, and the stone gave way. And with it, every word Corin had ever written. Down they fell. Not into Elodie's hands, but into the shaft, where they mingled with far less poetic offerings and were lost to the moat below. He wept, of course, quietly, behind the larder, where the smell of onions could disguise a cracked voice. Elodie never knew. Or perhaps she did. Years later, she was heard singing a tune that echoed the rhythm of one of Corin's clumsy verses. A song about stables, cats, and a bench no one ever found. You may laugh or sigh, but theirs is not the only tale of romance gone awry by way of the lavatory. One lady, noble, clever, bored, used to send scented notes folded into the petals of pressed violets. She'd place them in her suitor's boot while he visited the privy. One day, distracted, she dropped a message not into the boot, but into the pot itself. He never received it, though months later, during a siege, a gong farmer claimed to find a page that smelled of bergamot and betrayal. Even the king once, yes, even him, is rumored to have received a love token passed beneath the guardrobe door. A ring, wrapped in velvet, with a note that read, "For when your crown feels heavier than your heart." He never spoke of it, but he wore the ring. What I've come to understand, through crumpled pages and half-memories soaked into stone, is that humans are forever trying to send their hearts to places hearts have no business going. And sometimes, they choose the most unlikely places to be brave. Tonight, you rest near such a place. The air is thick with forgotten words. Somewhere, a breeze lifts and settles again, as if turning a page. Perhaps you too have letters you meant to send, or thoughts that never reached the eyes they were written for. That's all right. Sometimes, even when they fall into darkness, they are read by someone, even if only the walls. Sleep then, wrapped in the quiet truth that some messages still live, even if never received. And some feelings, especially the soft, foolish ones, are strong enough to be remembered by damp stone and crumpled parchment. The night is thick now, not with cold or mist, but with a kind of slowness, as though time itself has curled up beside you, content to drift. You've wandered further than usual this evening, all the way to the oldest part of the keep, where the stones no longer try to impress anyone, and even the dust seems to know your name. You hesitate before a squat, arched doorway. The hinges groan in recognition. I know, because I am one of them, rusted and loyal, still clinging to the frame as best I can. The door swings wide with a reluctant sigh, and you step into a chamber that smells faintly of candle wax, dried ink, and the distant memory of damp wool. This is, or once was, the bishop's private chapel. But more curiously, it adjoined a privy, a small, undecorated one, barely more than a hole and a bench tucked behind a thick velvet curtain. And it was here, long ago, that Bishop Aldrich of Wensforth earned his place in history, not for his sermons, nor his psalms, but for a tumble so unexpected that even the gargoyles blinked. You see, Aldrich was a man of considerable girth and unwavering certainty. He walked like a sermon, full of pauses and unnecessary flourishes, and his robes trailed like banners behind him, as if announcing his holiness to the cobblestones themselves. But one rainy evening, on his way to confession, he stopped at the privy to relieve both body and soul. Now, the floor, ancient, warped, and overly polished by well-meaning servants, had just been scrubbed with lye and lavender water. A dangerous mix. What happened next is debated even now by the spiders who nest behind the altar. Some say his sandal slipped on the threshold. Others claim he attempted a flourish of entry, tripped on his own hem, and sailed forward like a choir boy's hymn gone sharp. But all agree on one detail. He missed the seat entirely and disappeared, robes and all, into the chute below. A silence followed. Then a splash. Then nothing. You may wonder what became of him. Surely he perished, or was gravely injured. No. He emerged some 15 minutes later, reborn in stench and humility, climbing up from the moat with the help of 2 terrified kitchen boys and a ladder meant for harvesting apples. He said very little afterward, just muttered something about unorthodox cleansing, and requested hot water, strong wine, and absolute silence. But oh, how the whispers spread. For weeks, the castle rang with nervous laughter. Priests refused to bless the privy. A scribe began documenting all religious plummets in what he called the Psalter of Plops. One servant began claiming visions. I saw the bishop descend and rise again. Surely he is chosen. But Bishop Aldrich himself became gentler, less quick to scold. He no longer thundered about damnation, and once, I swear this is true, he laughed during Mass. Only once, and very softly, but it shook the rafters. Perhaps, in that fall, he lost something besides dignity. Some of that rigid certainty, some weight of importance he no longer wished to carry. There's a phrase still etched into the wood near the curtain. Mind thy step. Even angels slip. I believe it was carved by a monk with crooked fingers and a mischievous grin. It's faded now, but I remember. You sit for a moment now, resting your back against the stone bench, where the bishop once sat in dry contemplation. The air is cool and quiet, with only the soft rustle of a mouse in the corner and the faint, holy echo of splashes long past. And as you drift into the velvet edge of sleep, consider this. Even those who wear robes, who carry blessings and burdens alike, are not immune to gravity, or to the small, humbling moments that remind them they are, above all else, human. If ever you stumble, may it be somewhere soft, or at least somewhere with a ladder nearby. It's late now, so late that even the mice have stopped their foraging, and the wind outside hums low, like a lullaby lost in translation. You're not quite sure how you ended up here, in this odd little passage with uneven stones and walls that curve for no architectural reason. But the candle in your hand flickers, like it remembers something. From where I hang, a twisted iron hook once used to hold a lantern, now home to cobwebs and dust. I've heard enough to know you've reached one of the haunted garderobes. The kind no one mentions directly, though chambermaids cross themselves when passing it, and children dare each other to knock on its door. This is the southwest shaft, tucked beside the disused scullery, and it has never been quite right. The story begins, as most of these do, with something dropped and something denied. Long ago, how long I cannot say, for curses do not measure time in years, there was a lady of the court, known for her beauty, her sharpness, and her secrets. One night, during a storm so loud it muffled truths, she came to this garderobe with a letter in her hand and a tremble in her jaw. She did not return with either. Her body was found slumped beside the shaft, her lips pale, her fingers still clutching air. The letter was gone. The guards spoke in hushed tones about poisons and politics, but the old washerwoman said simply, she dropped her sin into the wrong hole, and it swallowed her back. Since then, no one's been able to use this privy comfortably. Some say it hisses when you try. Others claim it waits until you're most vulnerable, then releases a wind so cold it steals your thoughts for the rest of the night. One knight reportedly emerged from this chamber speaking fluent Latin, though he swore he'd never studied it. Even the spiders avoid the inner edge of the seat. But the strangest stories come from those who speak of voices. Not loud, not clear. Just a soft murmur, like a whisper heard through water, repeating your name, but never quite getting it right. Some say it calls out regrets. Others say it offers advice, usually unhelpful. There's a record, deep in the steward's logbooks, of a scullery boy who claimed the privy asked him for a riddle. When he failed to answer, the door refused to open for 3 hours. He swore the wood had grown teeth. One friar believed the shaft to be a portal, not to the underworld exactly, but to a realm of unfinished thoughts and badly timed exits. He threw in an apple once, just to see. It never landed. Now, I'm not one to jump to conclusions. I've been hanging here since before the West Wing existed, after all. But even I admit, this place feels different. The air here never warms. The stones always stay damp. And every so often the hook beside me turns gently, even when there's no breeze. You sit now, just outside the chamber, perhaps not brave enough to step in. That's fine. Caution is wisdom's gentler cousin. And as your thoughts begin to float, slow and drowsy as driftwood in a still lake, you may wonder, could a curse truly cling to a toilet? Could regret stain stone more deeply than waste? Even scholars aren't sure. Some say such stories were spread to keep servants from gossiping too close to privy doors. Others suggest they're metaphors, symbols of guilt, and the places we try to flush it. But I say this, even fear, over time, becomes part of a place's structure. It seeps into the mortar, nestles into corners, lingers in the silence between drips. So sleep gently tonight, traveler. Should your dreams bring you to an old door with a hook like me, and a whisper just beyond it, knock once, then walk on. Some doors aren't meant to be opened after dark, especially not the ones that already know your name. The night has grown contentedly still, as though even the bats have paused mid-flight to listen. Your steps take you upward now, to one of the oldest turrets, a narrow spiral staircase winding like a question no one's answered in a century. Here, at the top, is a room hardly larger than a cupboard, its only feature. A stone ledge overlooking the keep, and a peculiar wooden box built into the wall with a flap that opens out. Not quite a window, not quite a seat. From where I sit, a grainy patch of iron grating once meant to discourage nesting. I've watched countless humans puzzle over this contraption. Most assume it's a broken seat, or a foolish attempt at ventilation. But I know the truth. This was the pigeon privy. You laugh, perhaps. But I am serious in the slow, rusting way that old iron often is. In many keeps, especially those fond of messages, pigeons were not only tolerated, but treasured. They carried notes, warnings, and once, a very short love poem that accidentally made its way to the wrong bishop and caused 3 weeks of diplomatic silence. But here's the strange part. The pigeons also witnessed more than most. After all, they roosted just above the garderobes, built their nests in the eaves above the shafts, and occasionally even flapped down into the moat for reasons only pigeons understand. There was a belief, old and now mostly forgotten, that pigeons could carry not only messages, but prayers, and sometimes regrets. That if you whispered into the shaft as a pigeon passed overhead, it might catch a bit of your sorrow and fly it elsewhere, to the sky, or to someone who needed to hear it. I once watched a kitchen girl kneel beside the shaft, tears dampening her apron, whispering an apology she couldn't voice to her brother. A pigeon blinked, cooed, and flew away. The next morning, a letter arrived at the gate. From him. Coincidence? Perhaps. But we old things live on coincidence. Now, the birds weren't always helpful. One particularly rotund pigeon, Sir Clumps, as the servants named him, developed a taste for ink, and once ate half a confession before it could be delivered. Another built a nest entirely out of perfume sachets stolen from the Queen's garderobe, which resulted in the entire rookery smelling faintly of lavender and scandal. And yet, people believed. They left crumbs on the windowsills, murmured their secrets into empty privies, and looked up when feathers passed above, as if watching their shame take flight. One odd cleric, who spent far too much time in the latrine tower, claimed that pigeons were drawn to truth, that if your confession was honest, they'd hover. If not, they'd simply move along. He was eventually reassigned to the archives, where he spent his days trying to teach pigeons to transcribe sermons. The pigeons declined. There's even an inscription here, carved delicately into the stone by a hand far more practiced than most. Speak to the air, and it may answer with wings. Even now, if you sit beside the open flap, you may hear the flutter of one last feathered messenger. They still come sometimes. Not for messages, but for memory. To see if anyone still remembers what it meant to trust something small and soft with something heavy. You close your eyes. Perhaps you imagine whispering something, just for yourself. Not for delivery, just for release. And in the hush, you hear a coo. Faint, but there. So sleep now, with the knowledge that sometimes the oddest traditions carry the greatest tenderness. And if your dreams are visited by wings, do not fear. It may only be a pigeon, carrying your thoughts skyward. even the ones you never meant to share. You've made it back to the lower halls. That place where the ceiling dips, the light flickers oddly, and the stones remember being stepped on by feet in armor far too heavy for dignity. It smells here, faintly, of turnips, moldy parchment, and, on nights like this, something more sour, something weaponized. From where I slouch, a dented old bucket, once glorious in its coppery sheen, but now more rust than reflection. I can confirm this was not just the servants' corridor. This was once a battlefield. You may be imagining swords and cries and banners fluttering in defiance. No, this was the siege of the slop buckets. A conflict fought not with steel, but with everything else. Let me explain. It was a long siege, the kind that stretches through 3 harvests and 2 marriages. Supplies dwindled, tempers frayed, songs were written, then forgotten, because no one had enough energy to sing them. The enemy camped just beyond the eastern rise, out of arrow range, but close enough to shout rude things at night. They sang songs about the cook's soup. They mocked the steward's haircut. They suggested things about the queen's uncle that were both untrue and anatomically impossible. Eventually, something had to give. It began with a single act of desperation. A kitchen boy, red-haired, freckled, and fed up, filled a slop bucket with leftovers too foul for even the moat. He hurled it over the battlement with the cry, "You forgot your dinner!" It landed. It splattered. And it silenced the enemy's loot for a full day. This, naturally, escalated. Soon, every pail, pot, and privy was recruited. Buckets brimmed with cold gruel, rotten meat, and the contents of 3 unemptied garderobes. The castle rang with the clatter of chamber pots being passed up the towers like sacred relics. From my place beneath the stairs, I was filled no fewer than 6 times and emptied with heroic vigor. The guards began naming us. I was Sir Stenchworth. My cousin, the chamber pot, went by Dame Dread. The wooden bucket with the cracked rim, Old Leaker. He didn't last long. The enemy retaliated, of course. They launched cabbages, then fish, then, in a particularly dramatic moment, an entire sheep carcass wrapped in insults. But they could not match our volume. We had centuries of waste and spite. After a week, they withdrew, not defeated by arrows or fire, but by smell. One chronicler, prone to exaggeration, claimed birds refused to fly over the keep for a month. Another claimed the moat glowed in the dark, though I suspect that was more poetic than factual. Still, no one lingered near the eastern gate for quite some time. And we buckets. We were heroes. For one glorious week, we were scrubbed, mended, and even lined with cloth. A bard wrote a short verse, Ode to the Pail of Vengeance, but was asked to stop after the first chorus caused 3 knights to gag. You chuckle now, perhaps imagining these airborne affronts. But know this, in a time before plumbing, before diplomacy came with a seal and not a sling, a well-aimed slop bucket was strategy. And dignity? A resource as scarce as clean socks. Sleep gently tonight with this knowledge. Not every battle is noble. Not every victory is sung. But sometimes, the silliest wars are the ones remembered best. Not because they were grand, but because they were human. And if, someday, you feel you're out of clever words or sharp tools, remember, Sir Stenchworth, we weren't elegant. But we made them retreat. The castle has begun to shift in its sleep. Not literally, of course, though these stones do creak with age. But in that curious way buildings do when no one's watching. Doors settle deeper in their frames. Curtains sigh. Secrets stretch their legs. And here, in a quiet corridor near the guest quarters, you've stumbled upon the sort of place where status was once fought over not in council chambers, but in line. I am merely a nail. Yes, still me. Bent sideways in the wall beside the nicest garderobe in the entire castle. I've held up many signs in my time. Out of order. Do not enter. And, once memorably, reserved for the Duke of Plumshire and his digestive concerns. This was the velvet privy. Not for its seat, though it did have one, lined with padded fabric long since moth-eaten, but for the quality of those who used it. A room with a curtain, a window, a view, and, most importantly, a lock. It was said that whoever controlled the key to this lavatory controlled the flow of information, and, occasionally, gossip-induced blackmail. One noblewoman, Lady Sibylla, quick with words and quicker with bribes, once spent 5 solid months maneuvering her way into the morning time slot. That's right, a schedule. She used honeyed compliments, linen favors, and once, a velvet shoe stuffed with dried figs to secure her access between matins and breakfast. Why? Because that's when the steward's wife always visited the chamber next door, and Sibylla had things to overhear. It wasn't just about convenience. Privacy was a commodity, and with so few truly private spaces in the keep, a closed-door privy became something of a throne in its own right. There was a period of 6 weeks when the velvet privy was guarded. Yes, guarded. By a footman with a feathered hat and a very confused sense of duty. He stopped a priest, 2 nights, and once the queen herself. He was reassigned to poultry after that. But even with locks and schedules, politics seeped in. There were rumors of forged chamber keys, of fake perfumed sachets swapped to signal secret meetings. A small ring, carved with a bee insignia, was found wedged in the floorboards, thought to belong to the now defunct Order of the Gentle Flush, an unofficial alliance of courtiers who had, apparently, banded together to ensure mutual access and silence. The politics weren't just noble either. The servants had their own code. They knew who needed more time, who flushed with water, and who with silence, who left poems scratched in the wood, and who left less literary marks. One particularly elaborate graffiti still clings to the underside of the seat, a tiny drawing of a cat wearing a crown, holding what can only be described as a bucket scepter. I like to think it's a tribute to the siege of the slop buckets, though others insist it's a subtle jab at a constipated baron. But here's what makes it all so quietly wonderful. These were the spaces where truths were whispered, where masks slipped, because no one thought anyone was listening. A duchess once confessed to the old wood paneling, "Sometimes I wish I'd been a baker." No one responded, but the next morning, a loaf of sweet bread appeared outside her chamber, still warm. Even now you can feel it. The air slightly heavier with the perfume of long-dead intentions. Lavender, mostly. A favorite among courtiers and schemers alike. Easy to crush, hard to forget. So rest, thoughtful traveler. Know that in the quietest corners, behind the thickest curtains, atop the softest seats, history often unfolded not in shouts, but in sighs. And sometimes, it's not about where power is declared, but where it's released, discreetly, fragrantly, and always with a lock on the door. It's quiet now. The kind of quiet that settles not just in the halls, but in the bones. You're not walking anymore. You're sitting, resting, somewhere between the end of wandering and the start of dreaming. The air is still. The torches have all gone out, though the stone still holds their warmth. You're in a tower room, small, circular, forgotten, just above the moat. A perfect view of the stars. And, just beside you, a seat. The kind not carved for grandeur or ceremony, but for the simplest human need. From where I lie, a worn wooden beam beneath the seat, never seen, never thanked. I've held weight of all kinds, robes and regrets, chainmail and champagne hangovers. I have known the trembling knees of queens, and the quiet stillness of men who did not want to return to the feast. And I have known endings. Many. Some dignified. Some not. But let me tell you of one final drop. The sort that still echoes, faintly, if you sit just long enough and listen. It was an old king. Not legendary, not carved into stone or hymned in ballads. Just old. He had ruled for too long, perhaps. Not cruel, but weary. He no longer attended court. No longer held counsel. Just shuffled from room to room, as if waiting for someone to notice he was fading. One winter night, snow pressing against the arrow slits, wind moaning through the corridors, he rose quietly, unassisted, and walked to the upper guardrobe. No guard followed. No page waited. He sat, for a long time. When the steward checked in the morning, the king was gone. No sign of fall. No sign of struggle, just his crown, placed gently on the stone ledge beside the seat. Some say he climbed out, that he took the final drop not in shame, but in choice. That he joined the ghosts in the walls, the whispers in the shafts. Others say he died sitting up, eyes closed, finally at peace, finally unburdened. But I, the beam beneath him, remember warmth. Then stillness. Then the strange sense that, for once, no one needed to know more. You shift slightly now, perhaps wondering, is this true? Perhaps not entirely. But you see, we beams and hinges, stones and shadows. We carry stories the way trees carry rings. And sometimes, a tale becomes truer the longer it rests. What matters is this. Even kings, at the end of all their crowning and commanding, must sit where everyone sits. And in that moment, there is no difference between silk and sackcloth, between rulers and fools. There is only breath. And then, the quiet afterward. You settle back now, the stone behind you firm and familiar. Outside, the frogs have begun to sing again. Sleep now, with this truth folded gently beside you. There is no throne more honest than the one no one speaks of, and no farewell quite so humble as the one made without words, without witnesses, save for a quiet old beam and the hush of falling snow. Good night, dear dreamer. The last tale has dropped. The stories have ended, but the stillness remains. The stones no longer whisper. The buckets are quiet. Even the pigeons are asleep. You've walked far tonight, from high towers to low tunnels, through moats and mists, over echoes and absurdities. You've heard of ghosts and frogs, kings and buckets, and things best left unsaid, all cradled gently in the quiet absurdity of history. Here, in this final stillness, know that you're safe. No one is watching. No one is judging. The garderobes of time are closed, and all that remains is the peace that comes when even the most pressing troubles pass. So breathe softly. Let your eyes close. If your thoughts wander, let them. They know the way back. And if you find yourself dreaming of stone towers and lavender-scented ghosts, of mischievous pigeons and brave little buckets, know that you're welcome here, always. This quiet corner of useless wonder will still be waiting. Good night. Sleep deep. And may even your strangest dreams land gently. End of script. Sweet dreams.